I'm happy today to kind of use this opportunity of kind of describing what's the philosophy and the motivation behind doing this journal and how we're going about it and trying to maybe innovate a little bit in that space. All right, so maybe a few words about why we decided to do this. Partly a lot of this, I think, certainly for me, and I think for my colleagues as well, was motivated by a few things. We were sort of dissatisfied about our ecosystem of publication, which is, in our field, as you know, largely dominated by conferences. And I should say, I say this while having been myself heavily involved in conferences. So when I say these things, I don't say that, you know, someone else is responsible for the state of things. I feel I've been responsible. I've been working at trying to avoid these things, and this is me kind of trying to make another contribution. So I think these are hard problems, but we're hoping we can make a contribution here. But there's this increased sense of having rigid conference deadlines, putting unhealthy pressure on everyone, particularly the students, but I think not just the students, pretty much anyone who relies on the publication process as part of their living. There's also a lot of dissatisfaction about the decisions being made. There's one particular set of evidence that comes from the retrospective on the NeurIPS experiment that which you can go look up online, and that sort of seems to suggest that actually the ratings given by reviewers is not very predictive of the future impact as measured by citations that these publications have, or these works have. And I mean, there might be, you know, some things to say about the details of the experiment, but generally speaking, I think we do feel like this evaluation of potential impact as a criteria for determining whether we accept a paper at a conference is something that some people are struggling with and aren't quite sure that this is the right criteria. And without surprise, you know, it's actually really, really difficult. In a way, we kind of almost don't need that experiment, that NeurIPS experiment, to know that there's probably mistakes that are being made here, because it's about predicting the future, and that's, you know, that's going to be hard for sure. And so relying on that as much, even though I personally kind of accept that conferences are trying to do that, and maybe they're not, you know, doing the best job, but I'm sort of okay with the fact that it's doing this. But for me, that means there needs to be something else that doesn't rely as much on that for determining what gets kind of this acceptance seal of approval. I think generally there's a perceived diminishing quality of the peer review process. Part of that is due to there being so many submissions that puts in a lot of load on reviewers, despite, it was mentioned before, and actually reviewers, I think, largely doing a really good job of putting a lot of effort into it. I'm personally not that much in agreement with the idea that it's diminishing. Ever since I've been in this field, I've heard people complain about the quality of reviews. And having been in AC for iClear this year, there's so much iteration between authors and reviewers that actually they seem to be putting a lot of work into it. And so I think, I'm not sure I would agree with the diminishing quality, but I think we should always strive to do better. And maybe there's a better incentive structure we can put in place for encouraging what people would perceive as a better review process. And, you know, review processes are getting increasingly long at conferences, partly because of the size. You know, the NeurIPS, for instance, submission deadline keeps getting earlier and earlier in the year, but the decision is always early September. And having been a program chair, like, this is not because people are being lazy. It's just, it's such a huge process that and that requires a variety of checks at different stages, that this is where sort of we've going to be. And so initially, for a lot of these things, my thinking was, well, you know, if these are things you have a problem with, then maybe journals are, in particular for the first one, for having conference deadlines, journals seems kind of perfect for that. You know, you can submit pretty much any time. And I think, at least my perception is that your relationship as an author with a reviewer at a journal is a bit less adversarial, perhaps. Like, you know, you are trying to bring the work to be to a level of quote unquote quality that you're satisfied with as a reviewer. And so that would have been my initial kind of suggestion. But then when you look at the ecosystem of journals, you can see that there are certain things that have not perhaps evolved as much as things have evolved in conferences. And so this is where it seemed to be maybe an opportunity here to come up with a new journal. So when it comes to journals, I think generally, this is not entirely true, but generally they seem to favor a longer format of submissions. I think one reason we really like conferences is that they're shorter format, and because things are going so fast in our field currently and have been for a few years, the short format just seems quite appropriate and valuable to our community. Also, journals usually rely on single blind review, and we know all the problems that this comes with. So there seems to be an opportunity of having something that's actually double blind in its review, but still a journal. And despite say a conference like iClear adopting an open reviewing approach, no journals, as far as we knew, was using open review, certainly in machine learning. So that seemed also like an opportunity to have a journal that actually relies on that and hopefully sort of gets its benefits. So this is taking all of this into account that me and my colleagues decided to work on this idea of a new journal that we're calling Transactions on Machine Learning Research. So to address what we just talked about, it will be hosted on Open Review. It's a journal you can submit at any time. So it's not monthly even deadlines like I think the ACL rolling review. It's really any time, and then any paper will have its own timeline of its own reviewing timeline. We are trying to avoid this notion of relying too much on a subjective notion of potential impact in determining acceptance. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But essentially, we're going to try to really lean much more heavily on, are the claims made by the submission backed by appropriate evidence? And using that as the main driver for determining whether we accept the publication or not, which hopefully will make it less speculative. Now, I do feel like there's still a value for various venues to be making these editorial kind of statements that we think right now, based on our community, that seems to maybe be more exciting than other work that's out there. And they do this with acceptance at conferences, but they also do this with orals and spotlights. And I do find that valuable. I will spend more time looking at orals and spotlights at conferences. And even though I know there's going to be noise, somehow it is a useful potential source of information gathering for me. So because that seems valuable, we decided to try to separate, but still have that component of evaluation of potential impact or importance, using a notion of certifications that will be kind of an additional label on an accepted publication at TMLR. And I think it actually opens the door to a pretty rich and exciting ecosystem for our publication opportunities that I'll talk about in a bit. And then we will be double blind, unlike other journals. And we will try to aim for a fast turnaround. So hopefully being shorter than, notably conferences. On that specifically, this is the journey, what the review process journey of a submission will look like. In weeks 1 and 2, after submitting, the action editor, which is the equivalent of the area chair for a paper, will determine whether the submission is appropriate, that the submission they've been assigned to. And so this might be something as silly as they're not following the style files or the format, or it's just not in scope for the journal. And then assign, so they might desk reject a paper at that stage for that reason, and then otherwise assigns 3 reviewers. So that's between in the first 2 weeks. Then the next 2 weeks, weeks 2 and 3, 3 and 4, sorry, is when reviewers have to submit a review. That's the time they have to submit a review. And we'll talk about the reviewer workload later. But in order to try to make it possible for that to happen in such a short time. Then, once all 3 reviews are submitted, authors can, the reviews become public, everyone sees them, but the authors and reviewers can discuss, and they have 2 weeks to do that. They will actually have more than this, but they have 2 weeks where the reviewers are not asked to commit specifically to a particular decision yet. We kind of want to leave them some time to keep their mind open about the outcome for that submission. And then, so that's weeks 5 and 6. And then weeks 7 and 8, at the beginning of week 7, reviewers will be asked to submit their sort of official decision recommendation to the action editor, whether it should be accepted or not. And they can make recommendations about certifications that we'll talk about in a bit. So that happens in those last 2 weeks, weeks 7 and 8. And then week 9, the action editor will submit a decision on the paper. And the action editor throughout this process can actually participate in the discussion directly with the reviewers, even the authors. Again, we're relying on open review, so we leverage its features here. So hopefully within 9 weeks or so that's about 2 months, we can get from submission to acceptance, which would be a relatively short timeline. I talked about the acceptance criteria. So really there are like 2 sort of things that we want reviewers and action editors to have in mind when deciding whether a paper should be accepted. The main one is the first one. Are the claims made in the submission supported by accurate and convincing and clear evidence? And what that means, I think this is what most people want and actually think about when they think about a paper being accepted. And so we want to rely mostly on this. One thing that this means is that if a reviewer disagrees that the evidence backs the claims being made, at a conference oftentimes what that means is you do more experiments, you bring more evidence. But in our context here, alternatively, what you could just do is adjust your claims instead. And because that's the main criteria here, that would be OK. So maybe it means the implications of the work are reduced in the way they're communicated in the paper. And that's going to require somewhat of a little of a culture change in this context. But that would be OK. And then the second criteria, which we want that to be minor, but we want to have some notion of this here to avoid kind of cases where completely uninteresting work, like a sort of a report in a machine learning class, for instance, be actually submitted. So the second question and criteria is, would some individuals in TMLR's audience be interested in the findings of this paper? And notably, what we'll tell reviewers is that if you're unsure as to whether a submission satisfies this criteria, you should just assume that it does. It's really for something that is kind of a trivial and not novel whatsoever, and not really providing any interest to any value to our community. And so we're going to try to emphasize that this bar should be easy to meet for any interesting scientific endeavor reported in a paper. And we will try to sort of really enforce the first criteria here, which is the most important. I talked about certifications. So those are meant to capture the more subjective element of review processes that we tend to be familiar with. That's often referred to as potential for impact. When we start, we're gonna have 5, and I'm describing 4 of them here. The first one is outstanding certification. This is essentially going to be meant to be kind of a best paper award kind of certification. And this is something we actually think we're going to be giving possibly several months after a submission is accepted. Kind of look at, is it getting picked up in the community? Is it getting cited and so on? And have a bigger pool, I guess, of accepted submissions to be able to make a case for whether it should be an outstanding certified submission or accepted paper. The second one is featured certification. And this is where an action editor is mostly going to be responsible for assigning these based on recommendations from reviewers. And what we're thinking about, roughly, your mental model for this should be that, we would think this would be an oral and spotlight at a conference like NeurIPS or iClear or ICML. That's going to be certainly more speculative, but the idea is that it's just a certification. It's not really driving acceptance. And hopefully it provides some value to people who are trying to kind of assess or sort of, explore what is being explored right now and focus their attention on what our action editors think is more exciting. We also introduced 2 other certifications that is trying to add value to certain types of submissions. One is reproducibility certification. So this would be for reproduction of published work, but with added values such as baselines, analysis, ablations, insights. So we want to accept these kind of work that do provide additional value, but have kind of at their core more of a reproducibility objective. And we want to highlight that by giving them this certification. And then survey certification would be for a paper that, it gets accepted normally, but in addition to that, actually has a really nice survey of the topic or the approach that is being explored. And this might be useful in particular if you're entering the field. These might be papers that, would be good papers to look at if you want to sort of an entry point to a particular topic or approach. When a paper is given a certification like this, we're going to try to highlight them in the Open Review website with specific sections just for these. And hopefully that's judged valuable enough that you would want to seek those certifications because you would get more attention to your work. What makes me really excited about certifications is that once we have these and we treat those as really additional labels on publications, then we can potentially down the road eventually open this to a much larger ecosystem of certifications where maybe we could have different sub-communities actually be responsible for new certifications on paper. So if you have a workshop that represents a relatively large community, maybe down the road we could allow you to actually be the editorial responsible of person responsible or group responsible for giving certification towards a particular theme that your workshop is sort of animating and providing a forum for. It could even be if we ever get to a sort of journal to conference publication kind of system, we could even have conferences actually having certifications and using TMLR as a way for specifying which publications are actually featured at a large conference like conference or iClear ICML. This is very speculative. This is just me sort of thinking about projecting myself if we're successful with this first stage, where we could go. But I think this could drive a lot of value and richness in our publication and communication ecosystem for all of our work. All right, in terms of reviewing, we've been thinking about how much commitment we're asking for if you want to have this fast turnaround, in particular thinking about it in terms of rewards. One reward we're introducing here is that we're going to have a certification specifically for papers that are authored by our best reviewers. So we're going to use review ratings by action editors, a little bit like conferences use area chairs to rate reviews. And that's usually what drives how best reviewers are being determined by these conferences. So we're going to do something similar. And the way we're going to reward, one of the ways we're going to reward our best reviewers is that there's going to be a section for expert certification papers. And those are going to be the papers accepted by these reviewers that are amongst our best reviewers. So hopefully now you see a connection between doing a good job as a reviewer and getting your work promoted. And I will say, if you are a good reviewer that's detail-oriented and exhaustive, I think these are probably personally papers I would want to read. And so I think it also brings value potentially to our audience that maybe these are the people whose publications you might want to read first. And also, we are committed to try to share that list of best reviewers to the organizing committee of conferences, potentially, for instance, to consider those as potential area chairs where they're considering increasing their pool of area chairs. This is something we will be doing towards conferences. We don't control, the selection of area chairs of conferences, so we can only commit to trying to do that. But hopefully, this will also be found valuable and useful by conferences as well. And in terms of commitment for reviewers, we're thinking of no more than 6 papers per year, and specifically only 1 paper at a time that you'd have to review. So hopefully that means that at any given time, you're not overwhelmed by the amount of review, and therefore you can put in the appropriate amount of time and effort in each individual review that you're doing and responsible for. However, the commitment is that if you're assigned a review, you need to do it. There's no sort of, oh, can I do it in 2 weeks and so on. You have to sort of start the review process right now. And that's certainly kind of a change of culture in how we think about reviewing. And so we'll see how that goes. We'll have to monitor that, very closely to make sure that this is a model that is successful. But in a way, we're hoping that if you only get 1 paper at a time, that this is actually manageable. And that this is not too much of a burden at any given time. Of course, there might be exceptional circumstances. Normally, we would assume that because we'll be using, we'll be matching reviewers with papers based on expertise and previous papers published, that the paper would be appropriate, like amongst all reviewers, you ought to be sort of well positioned to review it. But also, of course, things like vacations or medical circumstances that would make you unavailable to review, those, of course, would be taken into account. But otherwise, if you get assigned to review, would expect it, if you're a reviewer and our pool of reviewers, that you would take care of it. Other features about our review process that I will go through quickly. Any open review user can request to review a submitted paper. So actually, we hope that this brings in a way for people to get more engaged in the review process. If you already see a submitted paper, it's relevant to you, you're going to read it anyway, then maybe you doing the extra work of actually reviewing it is not so bad for you. And also at the same time, if you think you're going to get maybe some credit if you do a good job by eventually getting an expert certification, maybe you're more inclined to doing that. We're going to encourage broader impact statement. That seems to be a norm established by NeurIPS that and that iClear has started using. So we're using more the iClear approach here, where it's encouraged. Accepted papers, we have a link to the open review page, so you can see the discussion. And we'll encourage accepted paper authors to submit code and a short video presentation of their work, along with the camera-ready version. I think people have found that to be really useful for conference papers. Now we've gone virtual, so we would like to sort of encourage that happening also for TMLR papers. All papers will remain on open review, even rejected ones. That's sort of, we're taking a similar approach to iClear here. The identity of the action editor will actually be disclosed on the open review page. This is something we're taking from TMLR. It encourages some transparency, which I think when you have, it's very consistent with our philosophy of being open. And it gives a bit of accountability on the action editor, which I think is important. We won't accept dual submissions or extensions of previously published work, unlike at GMLR. So at GMLR, if you submit, you can extend and accept a NeurIPS paper. In our case, we really expect original work that does not overlap with anything you've done before. Resubmissions, if your submission is rejected at open review, will be possible, but only if the action editor suggests it. And then if you do that, if you resubmit, you will have to link to the previous open review submission that you had made that was initially rejected. And the authors of rejected papers will stay anonymous. So, however, if you decide that at that point you want to de-anonymize because you prefer your submission being present with your name on it, then you will be able to do that. That's something you will be able to do at any point. However, if you do this, you cannot resubmit even if the action editor encouraged it, because at that point we will no longer be doing a double-blind submission process. Very quickly, I want to thank our advisory board, which has been very, very useful and valuable when we were drafting all of our different guidelines. Are now on our website. You can see them here. And if you get a chance, thank them. They've been really useful, and we're hoping to rely more on them also as we move forward. I want to thank our sponsors. In particular, they've been supporting us financially to support open review, because they had a lot of development to do. In particular, Melissa Buck, who I want to call out, because she's been amazing at open review. So really thank you for all your work. And thank you for our sponsors for allowing for that. Mila, DeepMind, CFAR, and the Vector Institute. And yeah, I want to thank my co-editors-in-chief, Raya and Joe. It's been great working with them and looking forward to work more with them. Our managing editor has been awesome. He worked with JMLR before and now is working with us, Fabian Pedragoza. Our partners, JMLR, who has welcomed us in the MLR family, Bernard Scholkoff in particular, very early on, encouraged that when we were thinking about a journal, but didn't know exactly where it should sit. So we really appreciated the support. And again, open review for all the developing work that they've been doing for us.